Hey guys, it's Chris. Plane crash survivors, people forced to commit acts of cannibalism, and the Japanese soldier left in the jungle for 29 years. Here are 10 of the most incredible survival stories ever. Number 10. Plane crash survivor. Having a fear of flying is quite common, but I'm sure this first survivor on our list may never want to travel by air again. Juliane Koepcke survived not only a plane crash, but also being lost in the jungle. She had been flying over the Peruvian rainforest with her mother back in 1971 when her plane was struck by lightning. It was Christmas Eve, and everyone was happy to be on their way home. Unfortunately, it would take Juliane longer than anticipated. They entered a dark and stormy cloud. Lightning struck the aircraft, and they spiraled down, falling over 2 miles into the jungle. She then struggled to find her way back to civilization. Juliane was only 17 years old at the time. According to a biographical report from the BBC, Juliane had a broken collarbone, had deep cuts on her legs, but no other serious injuries after landing. She was amazingly the only person on the flight to have survived. Luckily for Juliane, she had spent the last 6 months at a research station with her parents, where she had learned a lot about the jungle. This meant she had plenty of survival skills that would help her navigate the rainforest while she was seeking safety. And that's exactly what she did. After almost 2 weeks, Juliane was starving and close to death, but she continued pushing on through the jungle until she finally came upon a small hut with a boat docked on the river. After spending the night in the hut, men arrived in the morning and brought her to safety. Even though Juliane survived this horrible ordeal, her mother did not. She later found out that her mother had also survived the crash but had been gravely injured and could not move. When Juliane started her journey into the forest to look for help, her mother was still alive, only incapacitated. It had taken her several days to pass on, all the while stuck in the wreckage of the airplane. Number 9. Adrift in the Atlantic. There's nothing more impressive than being lost at sea and surviving. Stephen Callahan lived through what most of us would never be able to handle. He lived for 76 days adrift in the Atlantic Ocean on nothing but a flimsy life raft. Stephen was 29 years old when he decided to sail across the Atlantic. He made it one way without incident, but on his way back, something smashed into his boat and punched a hole in his hull. Within just a few minutes, his boat sank. Stephen was left on his tiny 6-foot life raft with nothing but enough food and water for a handful of days. What followed was a miserable trip through the ocean while Stephen lived in constant despair. On day 14, a ship passed him by without stopping. After a month at sea, Stephen had drifted all the way through the shipping lanes. There was basically no chance of a boat spotting him after that. After a while, Stephen floated into tropical waters. The days grew hotter. Stephen became incredibly dehydrated, and the salt water caused sores to blister his skin. It was a miracle that after 76 days alone on a raft, eating nothing but fish and surviving on a few sips of water a day, he was finally rescued. Some fishermen off the coast of Guadalupe found him. Today, Stephen is alive and healthy and even has a book about his terrifying sea adventure. So how do you think you'd handle being adrift at sea? Or maybe even stranded on a desert island? What would you do? Let me know in the comments section below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 8. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. The Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crashed into the Andes Mountains on October 12th of 1972. Out of 45 people on the airplane, only 16 of them survived the crash and the horrifying days that followed. Not only did the survivors of the crash need to find shelter and keep themselves safe from the harsh elements, but they also needed to find food. In order to endure their situation, the survivors resorted to cannibalism. The crash initially killed at least 12 people, and that left 33 survivors. Unfortunately, many of the survivors were horribly injured, and the group was about 11,000 feet up in the icy mountains being pummeled by snow. They had absolutely no protection from the cold and almost nothing to eat. And after a bit of discussion, the 33 survivors made the decision that they would need to eat the fresh corpses. A few weeks later, 6 more people died, and they were eaten too. Then finally, an avalanche came down on top of them, causing 8 more people to die. By December 12th, there were only 16 people left alive. It wasn't until 2 men climbed down the mountain and looked for help that everyone was saved. The men found some villagers, they told them what had happened, and by December 22nd, a pair of helicopters were sent to pick up the survivors. In the end, 16 men survived. Number 7. 9 days in Arizona. Most amazing survival stories that you hear are young people living through extraordinary circumstances. You don't often hear about the elderly. This next story is about a brave older woman and her dog who survived being trapped in the wilderness. Ann Rogers from Tucson was 72 years old when she survived being stuck for 9 days in the Arizona wilderness with her dog. She had set out for Phoenix, but after a while she ran out of gas, and then decided she would walk to find a station where she could pick up some gasoline and then get back to her car. Somehow the woman got turned around and ended up spending 9 days under the brutal sun. This is how horribly empty Arizona really is. One second you're driving, the next second you and your dog are screaming for help in the middle of a dusty wasteland. Anne managed to somehow get about 40 miles from the highway before she was discovered. But at least she got discovered in the end. Her car was found on April 3rd, and the search parties went looking for her, and they didn't stop until she was found on April 9th. Luckily, this woman was smart. She had spelled help with sticks and stones on the floor of the Arizona Canyon and made arrows pointing in the direction where she was walking. This helped rescuers to track her down and evacuate her using a helicopter. At the end of the day, Anne was perfectly fine and in extremely good spirits for a senior citizen who had been exposed to such brutal elements. And yes, her dog was okay too. Number 6. 29 years in the jungle. Almost everyone has heard the story of the Japanese soldiers who stayed hiding in the Philippines for decades after the end of World War II. But the truth of these rumors is even stranger than you might think. Of all the soldiers left behind in the Philippines, definitely the most famous is Hiro Unada, who had remained in the jungle for 29 years. When he was finally found in 1974, he was still wearing his Imperial Japanese uniform, which he put on almost 3 decades ago. He had officially been declared dead in 1959, but was tracked down by a Japanese student in the 70s who had heard rumors of a faithful soldier still living in the Philippines. But even after the student found Onada, he refused to surrender. He said he would not return home until he received orders from his superiors. The student ended up having to go back to Japan, find the original commander who had ordered Onada to stay in the jungle during the final years of the war, and bring him to where the soldier was. Only then, after 29 years, did Onada surrender. But his story of survival is quite unique. Other than being the very last Japanese soldier to surrender almost 30 years too late, Onada was a hardcore survivalist. He believed that he was still at war, and would sometimes even clash with local residents. He was finally taken out of the jungle and brought back to Tokyo on March 12th of 1974. Number 5. The Donner Party. The Donner Party was one of the most gruesome pilgrimages in the New World. According to History.com, the Donner Party began their trip very late in the pioneering season. They were traveling from east to west and were the last major pioneering party of 1846. It was risky enough back in those days to cross America on foot, but doing it during the winter was absolutely unheard of. After reaching Wyoming, the pioneers took an untested shortcut. This resulted in disaster. They had to cut across a salt desert that they didn't know was there, and instead of saving time, the shortcut nearly killed all of them, with many dying from thirst. To make things even worse, most of the Donner Party were young children. Out of 81 people who set off in the party, more than half were under the age of 18. The pilgrims took way too long to reach California. They ended up getting stuck in the snow in the middle of December, and a separate team of men went off on their own to seek rescue. There ended up being a few episodes of cannibalism, a little bit of human sacrifice, a few duels, and a slight pinch of murder. But out of 81 pioneers that set off, only 45 walked out alive after being found by a rescue party. Number 4. Aron Ralston. Aron Ralston didn't survive a plane crash, and he wasn't stuck in the jungle. He instead got trapped inside of Blue John Canyon in the southeast of Utah. He was out enjoying the day and climbing alone when a boulder dislodged from overhead and pinned his right wrist against the canyon wall. Aron was a skilled outdoorsman, a mechanical engineer, and up until that point, he had thought of himself as kind of invincible. He ended up trapped for a full 5 days before gaining the courage he needed to finally amputate his arm with his dull pocket knife. Only after he snapped the bones in his arm and sawed it off was he able to rappel the rest of the way down the canyon and then hike 7 miles to safety. All the while, his arm was dripping blood through the desert. This is definitely one of the most popular survival stories, and it was even turned into a film in 2010 called 127 Hours, starring James Franco. Number 3. Glass and the Revenant. Have you seen the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio? If you have, this story might sound familiar. Hugh Glass was born in 1783 and was an American frontiersman and the inspiration for the film The Revenant. Hugh was a fur trapper who had apparently survived a horrifying bear attack and then traveled hundreds of miles through the terrifying North American wilderness to get his revenge. Hugh apparently killed the bear that attacked him with his own 2 hands, though he was left with a broken leg, a punctured throat, and quite a few other wounds. He ended up being put in a shallow grave because his wounds were so bad that the men he was traveling with didn't think he would survive. But he eventually regained his strength, fought his way out of the grave, and then he traveled 300 miles on foot to kill the 2 men who had abandoned him when he was injured. Of course, this would be a remarkable story of survival and revenge if all of it were true, but considering the story is based on word of mouth passed down since the 1800s, it's almost impossible to determine what's real and what isn't. Number 2. The Gremlin Special. On May 13, 1945, 24 men and women boarded the Gremlin Special and flew over a valley hidden in the country of New Guinea where roughly 100,000 tribespeople were still living a Stone Age existence. The plane flew low so those on board could look down into the native villages and fields. But unfortunately, the airplane crashed. Only 5 survived the initial destruction, but all but 1 was injured. After the survivors climbed down from the crash site, they were greeted by the tribal residents. They had heard that the men and women living in the valley were cannibals, but luckily, everything seemed friendly enough. Nobody was cannibalized and nobody was eaten, and eventually a rescue team was sent into the valley to bring the survivors out. It was quite the ordeal, but at least nobody had to eat anyone. Number 1. The LYKOV family. The LYKOVs were an extraordinary family. In 1936, the family made the hard decision to flee their home of LYKOV to escape religious persecution and move into the middle of nowhere. Karp and Akulina LYKOV fled with their 2 children 160 miles away from any other settlement in the middle of the frozen taiga wilderness. Their survival was more of a choice than a situation they found themselves in. The couple had 2 more children, and for the next 4 decades they lived in total isolation. It wasn't until 1978 that a helicopter pilot accidentally came upon the family. The pilot had been flying a geological group into the region to do some surveys, and the geologists decided to make contact with the family. However, the LYKOV family refused to leave the place they had created for themselves. But after 40 years, luck began to run out for the family. Akulina died from hunger in 1961. 3 of her children died in 1981 because of their poor diet. And finally, Karp LYKOV passed away in 1988. The only one still remaining is the daughter Agafia, who apparently still lives in the wilderness as of 2019, surviving all alone and living a simple life. Thanks for watching. What's the toughest thing you've ever survived? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and tune in soon for another fantastic video.